American Politics Today by Bianco and Canon, Chapter 8, Elections. Who gets to represent the people? I won the election, got 71 million legal votes. Bad things happened, which our observers were not allowed to see. Never happened before. Millions of mail-in ballots were sent to people who never asked for them. President Donald Trump, November 7th, 2020. I've worked extensively with the election officials in the city of Detroit, and they take it seriously. Are there errors that happen? Sure, but that's not fraud. I never saw any sort of fraud. It never happens because you can't get away with it. It's easier to just try and win elections. Josh Venable, Michigan Republican political operative. Every 2 years, Americans elect 435 House members and 33 or so senators. Every 4 years, as in 2020. We also elect a president. The outcomes of these elections are scrutinized because they provide insights into what voters are thinking, because they reveal the usefulness of different campaign strategies, or simply because of what's at stake. One example in 2020 was the Senate election in Maine between Republican incumbent Susan Collins and her Democratic challenger, Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, Sarah Gideon. One reason this election was important was that Democrats needed to flip only 4 Senate seats to gain control of the chamber, and Maine was one of the few states in 2020 where a Democratic challenger had a good chance of unseating an incumbent. Another was that Collins was one of the few remaining moderate Republicans in the Senate, as well as an occasional supporter of Democratic initiatives. But Collins had also supported many of President Trump's policy initiatives. Although she did not vote for Trump's last-minute Supreme Court nominee, Amy Coney Barrett. Ultimately, Collins won re-election, a surprise to observers who had predicted a Gideon win based on her popularity. Her well-funded campaign and discontent with Collins' victory illustrates an important truth. Even though most Americans are thoroughly disgusted with politicians and politics, most congressional incumbents are re-elected. Our task is to understand this outcome. Did Mainers support Collins because she was a Republican or because of Donald Trump? What role did the campaign play or the challengers record? Did Maine's use of ranked choice voting system help or hurt Gideon? Answers to these questions help explain whether Collins' victory is a one-off, idiosyncratic win or an indication of how U.S. elections will play out in 2022 and beyond. The 2020 Senate election in Maine is also a good example of central themes of this text. Elections, no matter, watching the Maine race would think that Collins and Gideon would support the same policies if elected. Candidates competing for political office offer the people distinct competing visions of what the federal government should do, from what the tax code should look like to what regulations the government should impose on individuals and corporations. In a very real sense, elections are how Americans resolve conflict over whose visions of government policy should prevail, at least until the next election. American elections are structured by rules. Maine is somewhat unique in using ranked choice voting, a system wherein voters rank all the candidates running for a given office instead of choosing just one. If no candidate wins a majority of first place votes, the candidate with the lowest number of first place votes is eliminated, and that candidate's votes are redistributed according to his or her supporters. Second place votes. In other states, an outcome where neither candidate wins an outright majority leads to a runoff between the top two finishers. These rules matter. Runoff elections often produce surprising outcomes because they occur a month or more after Election Day, allowing candidates to refine their message, but also forcing them to motivate supporters to return to the polls a second time. And in 2020, party control of the Senate hinged on the results of two runoffs in Georgia. The 2020 Senate contest in Maine highlights fundamental facts about American elections. Candidates run for different offices and represent different constituents. Locally set rules determine who runs, who votes, and how money is raised and spent. Even ballot layouts and how votes are cast and counted vary across states. Who wins is up to ordinary citizens. After his defeat, Donald Trump alleged that American elections were rigged, but there is no evidence to support his claims. Rather, as Republican operative Josh Venable asserts, the only way to win is to convince voters that you are the best person for the job. In this chapter, we show how elections are run, how they are decided, and how they affect policymaking. Ultimately, how meaningful was Susan Collins' victory in Maine in 2020, or Democrats' failure to win a Senate majority? What do election results tell us about why some candidates win and others lose? Why do these outcomes matter in American politics? How do American elections work? The American political system is a representative democracy. Americans do not make policy choices themselves, but they vote for individuals who make these choices on their behalf. Thus, we begin by describing the rules and procedures that define American national elections. Our working assumption for explaining the rules and processes of elections, as well as the behavior of candidates and voters, is that they are tied directly to what elections do. Select representatives give citizens the ability to influence the direction of government policy and provide citizens with the opportunity to reward and punish office holders seeking re-election. The most visible function of American elections is the selection of office holders, including at the national level, members of the House and Senate, and the president and vice president. Candidates can be incumbents running for re-election to their current office, or challengers running for the office for the first time. Because America is a representative democracy by voting in elections, Americans have an indirect effect on government policy. Although citizens do not make policy choices themselves, they determine which individuals get to make these choices. In this way, elections connect citizen preferences and government actions. Although the fundamental choice in an election is between two or more candidates running for some political office, elections also involve a choice between candidates' policy platforms, the set of policies and programs they promise to carry out if elected. By investigating candidates' platforms, citizens learn about the range of options for government policy. Moreover, their voting decisions determine who gets to make choices about future government policy and thereby shape policy itself. For example, in the 2020 elections, Democrats wanted to ensure they kept their House majority, which would allow them to block Republican policy initiatives and investigate the Trump administration's actions if Trump was reelected. They also wanted to gain a Senate majority and win the presidency. which would allow them to formulate and enact new policies rather than responding to Republican initiatives. The election process also creates a way to hold incumbents accountable. When citizens choose between voting for an incumbent or a challenger, they can consider the incumbent's performance over his or her previous terms in office and ask, has he or she done a good job on the issues I care about? Citizens who answer yes typically vote for the incumbent, and those who say no typically vote for the challenger. These evaluations are significant because they make incumbents responsive to their constituents' demands. If an elected official anticipates that some constituents will consider his or her performance objectively when making their decision, rather than simply reflecting their partisanship, the official will try to take actions that the constituents will look back upon favorably when they're in the voting booth. Otherwise, voters can opt to remove the official from office because they disapprove of his or her performance and believe the country will fare better if a different candidate wins. 2 stages of elections. Candidates running for federal office, House, Senate, or President, face a 2-step procedure. First, if prospective candidates want to run on behalf of a political party, they must win the party's nomination in a primary election. If the would-be candidates want to run as independents, they need to gather signatures on a petition to secure a spot on the ballot. Different states hold either open primaries, semi-closed primaries, or closed primaries, and state law sets the timing of these elections. For House and Senate seats, a few states hold single primaries in which there is one election involving candidates from both parties, with the top 2 finalists, regardless of party, receiving nominations to the general election. The second step in the election process is the general election, which is held throughout the nation on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Federal law designates this day as Election Day. General elections determine who wins elected positions in government. The offices at stake vary depending on the year. Presidential elections occur every 4 years, 2012, 2016, 2020. In a presidential election year, Americans elect the entire House of Representatives, 1/3 of the Senate, and President and Vice President. During midterms, 2014, 2018, 2022, there is no presidential contest, but the entire House and 1/3 of the Senate are up for election. One implication of this 2-step process of primary and general elections is that sometimes the winner of a primary is not a party's best candidate for the general election. For example, in the 2020 presidential race, one of the principal arguments for choosing someone other than Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee, such as Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Amy Klobuchar, or Senator Elizabeth Warren, was that this candidate would have had a better chance of winning the general election. While Biden had many enthusiastic supporters, a first-rate campaign organization, and considerable Washington experience as senator and vice president, he was also strongly disliked by a sizable fraction of the American electorate. Because of his age, his moderately liberal policy stances, and his career in politics, in the end, Biden was a good fit for the unique circumstances of the 2020 election, as he attracted support from working-class white Midwestern voters who had supported Donald Trump in the 2016, while increasing turnout from minority voters in crucial swing states. Mechanics of elections. The Constitution limits voting rights to American citizens who are at least 18 years old. There are also restrictions on voter eligibility that vary across states, including residency requirements, usually 30 days, and prohibitions for people convicted of a major crime. A recent development in American elections is an increase in the practice of automatic absentee voting, in which someone can request an absentee ballot without having to provide a reason, such as being out of town on election day. Most states also allow early voting in the weeks prior to election day, and some allow voters to send in ballots by mail. The most fundamental feature of American elections is that office holders are elected in a single member districts in which only the winner of most votes takes office. Although both of these states' senators represent the whole state, they are elected separately, usually in different years. Senate candidates compete statewide. House candidates compete in congressional districts. In most states, the congressional district lines are drawn by state legislators. In some states, nonpartisan commissions or committees of judges perform this function. For details on redistricting, see Chapter 10. Because members of the House and Senate are elected from specific geographic areas, they are often represent very different kinds of people. Their constituents differ in terms of age, race, income level, occupation, and political leaning, including party affiliation and ideology. Therefore, legislators from different areas of the country face highly diverse demands from their constituents, leading them to pursue very dissimilar kinds of policies. For example, Democratic Senator Charles Schumer represents the fairly liberal state of New York, where most people take some sort of pro-choice position on abortion rights, while Republican Senator Richard Shelby represents the conservative state of Alabama, where most voters have long opposed to abortions. Suppose the Senate votes on a proposal to ban all abortions after the 12th week of pregnancy. Shelby knows that most of his constituents would probably want him to vote for the proposal, and Schumer knows that most of his constituents would probably want him to vote against it. This example illustrates that congressional conflicts over policy often reflect differences in constituents' demands. Schumer and Shelby themselves may hold different views on abortion rights, but even if they agreed, their constituents' distinct demands would make it likely that, as legislators, they would vote differently. Most House and Senate contests involve plurality voting. The candidate who gets the most votes wins. However, some states use majority voting, meaning that a candidate needs more than 50% of the vote to win. In these states, if no candidate has a majority, a runoff election takes place between the top two finishers. Ballots and vote counting. Americans vote by using a variety of machines and ballot structures based on where they live. States either use electronic touchscreen voting machines, usually with some sort of paper receipt to allow manual recounts, or have voters fill out paper ballots that are then scanned and recorded. When the polls close, workers transcribe vote totals from the various machines, then hand carry the totals and individual ballots or receipts to county boards of election, where totals are aggregated and sent to state agencies, which certify the results. The process is largely run by volunteers, with both major parties having participants or observers at all stages. Most states have laws that allow vote recounts if a race is sufficiently close, typically within 1% or less. Even when a recount occurs, it may be impossible to definitively determine who won a particular election, as the statutes that determine which ballots are valid are often open to interpretation. What is clear is that election rules can affect results, particularly in close races. Small changes in the rules governing elections can easily change outcomes. Presidential elections. Many of the rules governing elections, such as who is eligible to vote, are the same for both presidential and congressional elections. However, presidential contests have several unique rules regarding how nominees are determined and how votes are counted. Moreover, the constitutional requirements for presidential candidates are also somewhat stricter than those for congressional candidates. See Nuts and Bolts 8.1. The nomination primaries and caucuses. Presidential nominees from the Democratic to Republican parties are determined by the outcomes of state-level primaries and caucuses held over a 5-month period beginning in January of an election year. Primary and caucus voters select a candidate, but their votes do not count toward the election of that candidate. Their votes instead count toward the selection of delegates who have pledged to support the candidate, who then go on to attend the party nomination conventions. There, the delegates cast votes that determine their party's presidential and vice presidential nominees. The format of these elections, including their timing and the number of delegates selected per state, is determined on a state-by-state basis by the state and national party organizations. A candidate's principal goal is to win as many delegates as possible. The detail of translating primary and caucus votes into convention delegates vary from state to state, but some general rules apply. All Democratic primaries and caucuses are proportional allocation to divide each state's delegates between the candidates. Thus, if a candidate receives 40% of the votes in a state's primary, the candidate gets roughly 40% of the convention delegates from the state. Some Republicans contests use proportional allocations, but others use winner-take-all system. In these states, the candidate who receives the most votes gets all the convention delegates. These rules can have significant effect on candidates' campaign strategies and the outcome of the nomination process. See how it works. Nominating presidential candidates in Chapter 7. The order in which the primaries and caucuses in different states takes place is another important factor. Because many candidacies do not survive beyond early contests, most presidential candidates pour everything they have into the first few contests. Candidates who do well early on attract financial contributions, campaign workers, endorsements, and additional media coverage, all of which enable them to move on to subsequent primaries or caucuses. But for candidates who do poorly in the first contests, contributions and coverage dry up, leaving these candidates with no alternative but to drop out of the race. For example, more than 20 candidates entered the race for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination. Several withdrew before any convention delegates were selected. By mid-March, 2 months into the process and 5 months before the convention, where the nominee would actually be selected, the race was down to only two serious candidates, Sanders and Biden. For many years, Iowa and New Hampshire have held the first presidential nomination contests, with the Iowa Caucuses taking place a week before the New Hampshire primary. These states' position at the beginning of the process is largely a historical accident, but party officials from other states often complain about the disproportionate influence of these states. The party's national committees can issue rules and requirements about the timing of state presidential primaries, but state law sets the election dates, meaning that a national committee's directives may not be followed. As a result, the initial 2020 nomination process was roughly the same as in previous years, with the exception of California's move to March. With Iowa and New Hampshire holding the initial contests in early February 2020, followed by a primary in South Carolina and a caucus in Nevada later in the month, and the remaining contests beginning in March and continuing through June, although some were delayed due to COVID-19. The National Convention. The presidential nomination conventions happen late in the summer of an election year. Their main task is to select the party's presidential nominee. Although usually the vote at the convention is a formality, in most recent presidential contests, one candidate has emerged from the nomination process leading up to the convention with a clear majority of delegates and has been able to win the nomination on the first ballot. To get the nomination, a candidate needs the support of a majority of the delegates. If no candidate receives a majority after the first round of voting at the convention, the voting continues until someone does. When a sitting president runs for a re-election, as Donald Trump did in 2020, he or she typically faces little opposition for the party's general election nomination. After the delegates nominate a presidential candidate, they nominate a vice presidential candidate. The presidential nominee chooses this running mate generally shortly before the convention, and the delegates almost always ratify this choice without much debate. Convention delegates also vote on the party platform, which describes what kinds of policies the party's candidates will supposedly seek to enact if they are elected. The final purpose of a convention is to attract public attention to the party and its nominees. Public figures give speeches during the evening sessions when all major television networks have live coverage. At the same recent conventions, both parties have drawn press attention by recruiting speakers who support their political goals despite being associated with the opposing party. At the 2020 Democratic Convention, Republicans John Kasich, former governor of Ohio, and Colin Powell, Secretary of State under George W. Bush, gave televised primetime speeches voicing their support for Joe Biden. Once presidential candidates are nominated, the general election campaign officially begins. Although it often unofficially starts much earlier, as soon as the presumptive nominees are known. We will say more about presidential campaigns in a later section. Counting presidential votes. Let's assume for a moment that the campaigning is over and that election day has arrived. Even though in the voting booth, people choose between candidates by name, a choice that constitutes the popular vote. This vote is not directly for a presidential candidate. Rather, when you select your preferred candidate's name, you are choosing that person's slate of pledged supporters from your state to serve as electors. We will then vote to elect the president. The number of electors for each state equals the state's number, a house of House members, which varies by state population, plus the number of senators, 2 per state. Altogether, the electors choose by the citizens of each state constitute the Electoral College, the body that casts electoral votes to formally select the president. In most states, the electoral votes are allocated on a winner-take-all basis. The candidate who receives the most votes from a given state's citizens gets all of the state's electoral votes. But 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, allocate most of their electoral votes at the congressional district level. In those states, the candidate who wins the most votes in each congressional district wins that district's single electoral vote. Then the remaining 2 electoral votes go to the candidate who gets the most votes statewide. See nuts and bolt 8.2 for state-by-state electoral vote totals. The winner-take-all method of allocating most states' electoral votes makes candidates focus their attention on 2 kinds of states: high population states with lots of electoral votes, and so-called swing states, where the contest is relatively close. Here is a close-up of the nuts and bolts. And then I'm also going to do the popular vote so that you can pause this and look at this closer. It's better for a candidate to spend a day campaigning in California, 55 electoral votes, than in Montana, 3 electoral votes. However, if one candidate is sure to win a particular state, both candidates will direct their efforts elsewhere. This is why during the final weeks of the 2020 campaign, the Trump team was on defense trying to hold Florida and key Rust Belt states. Following this strategy described in the How It Works feature, while the Biden campaign was targeting former Republican strongholds, Georgia, Texas, and Arizona, while most Americans that the winner of the presidential election is decided on election day, this outcome is actually just the first step in a process that determines the winner. After citizens' votes are counted, each state's slate of electors meet in December in the state capitals at their meetings. The electors are almost always vote for the presidential candidate they have pledged support. After the votes are certified by a joint session of Congress, the candidates who wins a majority of the nation's electoral votes, at least 270, is the new president. If no candidate receives a majority of the Electoral College votes, the members of the House of Representatives choose the winner. They follow a procedure in which the members from each state decide which candidate to support and then cast one collective vote per state, with the winner needing a majority of these state level votes to win. This procedure has not been used since 1824, although it might be required if a third-party candidate wins a significant number of electoral votes or if a state's electors refuse to cast their votes. A presidential candidate can win the Electoral College vote and thus election without receiving a majority of the votes cast by citizens. See Figure 8.1. In 2016, Democrat Hillary Clinton received several million more votes than Donald Trump because of large majorities in states such as California and New York. but Trump won a majority in the Electoral College because of narrow victories in states such as Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. A similar outcome occurred in 2000, leading to Republican George W. Bush's victory over Democrat Al Gore. Here is this. You may pause this so that you can look at this more closely. And this is Donald Trump's Electoral College in 2020. Electoral campaigns. Now that we have reviewed the main steps of how American elections work, we will focus on in this section in the campaign process and what candidates do to convince people to vote for them on election day. Our emphasis is on things that candidates do regardless of the office they are running for across the entire election cycle. The 2-year period between general elections. The fundamentals. Before talking about all things candidates and their supporters do to shape election outcomes, it is crucial to understand that many important factors are beyond their control. Political scientists call these factors the fundamentals. In part, the fundamentals include the rules that govern elections, photo ID requirements for voting, which shape voter turnout in ways that hurt some candidates, usually Democrats, and help others, are one good example of electoral rules that affect outcomes. Another fundamental is how many people in a candidate's district share his or her party ID. As we showed in Chapter 7, an individual's party ID is a strong influence on his or her voting decisions. Political scientists refer to states or districts that have roughly equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans as swing districts, meaning that candidates from both parties have a good chance of winning. Safe districts are those where one party has a significant majority, so candidates from that party are likely to win election and those from the other party are not. Over the last 2 generations, the number of safe districts and states has increased somewhat, with rural areas becoming more solidly Republican and urban areas trending Democratic. Particularly in presidential elections, economic conditions also have strong effect on who wins. As you can see in the What Do They Say Facts feature on page 259, a stronger economy benefits incumbent presidents running for re-election. For example, Obama in 2012, while a weak economy hurts incumbents Jimmy Carter in 1980 and their successors, John McCain in 2008. Of course, fundamentalists have to be taken in context. Big one-time shocks have unique effects. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic caused a drop in second quarter GDP that was so big we can't even include it in the figure. That's why there's an asterisk next to the 2020 data point. As we discussed later, while most voters gave Trump low marks for his management of the pandemic and the economic downturn, his approval ratings did not change very much. That said, Trump's ratings were already low prior to the pandemic, and the social and economic turmoil limited his ability to attract the additional support needed to get reelected. Candidates might like to think that they can convince people to vote for them regardless of circumstances, but the fundamentals like party ID and economic conditions tell us which candidates face an uphill fight or an easy ride, either because voters are well aware of these factors before the campaign begins, or because campaigns are mechanisms by which voters become informed about them. It may not be fair to reward or blame candidates for the state of the economy or even presidents have only limited control over economic growth or unemployment levels. For better or worse, however, a significant fraction of American voters behave this way. Similarly, for some challengers, defeat is a foregone conclusion because they are running in a state or district that is safe for the other party. No matter what they do, most of the electorate is unlikely to support them. It's important to remember that the fundamentals are not the final word in an election. The backgrounds of the candidates, their qualifications for office, and the decisions they make about their campaigns sometimes have significant, even decisive effects. Here is this. For example, Democrat Connor Lamb won a 2018 special election in a strongly Republican Pennsylvania congressional district, although President Trump won there in 2016 by a 20-point margin. At least part of Lamb's victory was due to a decline in Trump's popularity and the resignation of the district's Republican incumbent due to scandal. But Lamb, who took moderate positions on issues such as gun control, was widely regarded as the stronger, more energetic candidate. Under these conditions, Republican voters appear to have seen Lamb as someone who would do a better job protecting their district's interest and supported him on that basis. Setting the stage. On the day after any election, candidates, party officials, and interest groups all start thinking about the next election cycle. They consider who won and who lost, which incumbents look like safe bets for re-election, and which ones might be vulnerable, who might retire soon or run for another office in the next election, and whether the election returns reveal new information about the kinds of campaigns or issues that might increase voter turnout support. Party committees and candidates also consider the likelihood that incumbents may retire, thereby creating an open seat. Open seats are of special interest because incumbents generally hold an election advantage. When a seat opens up, candidates from the party that does not control the seat know that they might have a better chance to win because they will not have to run against an incumbent. Presidential campaigns also take incumbency into account. Virtually all first-term presidents run for re-election. Potential challengers in the opposing party study the results of the last election to see how many votes the president received and how this support was distributed across the states to determine their own chances of winning against the incumbent. Candidates in the president's party make the same calculations. Although no sitting president in the 20th century was denied renomination, nonetheless, some presidents, Harry Truman in 1952, Lyndon Johnson in 1968, retired because their chances of being renominated were not good, while others, Gerald Ford in 1976, Jimmy Carter in 1980, barely won tough primary contests. Before the campaign. While in office, most sitting House members, senators, and presidents work throughout the election cycle to secure their re-election. Political scientists describe this activity as the permanent campaign to stay in office. Incumbents have to do two things: keep the constituents happy and raise money for the campaign, as well as we will see in Chapter 10. I'm so sorry about that. Congressional incumbents pursue the first goal by taking actions that reflect the demands of their constituents. This in turn boosts voters' retrospective evaluations of the incumbents at election time. Incumbent presidents make the same calculations. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Donald Trump faced the decision of when to relax social distancing adversaries or advisories and allow the economy to reopen. Part of Trump's calculation was to balance safety, preventing the spread of the virus, with the goal of preventing a prolonged economic downturn. But Trump's calculations undoubtedly included the goal of ensuring that voters would remember his actions in a positive way when they returned to the polls in November of 2020. Of course, many presidential actions are taken in response to events rather than initiated to gain voter support, particularly in the case of wars and pandemic. It is far-fetched to say that presidents take hostile actions for political gain. Even so, presidents, just like other politicians, are keenly aware of the political consequences of their actions and the need to build a record they can run on in the next election. Fundraising. Candidates for all offices, incumbents and challengers alike, also devote considerable time before the campaign to raising campaign funds. Fundraising helps an incumbent in two ways. First, it ensures that if the incumbent faces a strong opponent, he or she will have enough money to run an aggressive campaign. Second, successful fundraising deters opposition. Potential challengers are less likely to run against an incumbent if that individual is well funded with a sizable campaign war chest. We'll discuss campaign funding raising in more detail later in the chapter. Promises and party positions. Candidates also spend time before and sometimes during a campaign developing or refining their campaign platform, which includes stances on issues and promises about how the candidate will act in office. In writing their platforms, candidates may be constrained by positions they have taken in the past or their party affiliation. For one thing, candidates whose positions vary from one election to another or between the primary and general elections often lose support from voters who see the changes as a sign of manipulation. As we saw in Chapter 7, the parties have strong brand identities that lead to many citizens to associate Democrats with liberal policies and Republicans with conservative ones. As a result, candidates often find it difficult to make campaign promises that contradict these perceptions. A candidate's positions are also influenced by demands from potential supporters. For example, in a state or district with many conservative or Republican voters, opposition to Obamacare or to amnesty for illegal immigrants might be winning electoral strategy. Just as support for these proposals would generally be helpful for candidates running in states or districts where most voters are moderate to liberal or Democrats. The two-step electoral process in American elections also influence candidate positions to win office. Candidates have to campaign 3 times. First, to build a staff and gain contributors and volunteers, the so-called silent primary or money primary. Then in a primary to get on the ballot, and then in a general election. This process gives candidates an incentive to take relatively extreme policy positions and encourages the entry of relatively extreme candidates, because party activists, contributors, and primary voters, the people who support candidates, need to attract in the first 2 steps, hold more extreme positions than voters in the general election. Thus, in typical congressional district Republican candidates win primaries by taking conservative positions, while Democratic candidates win primaries by upholding liberal views. However, a position or promise that attracts votes in a primary election might not work so well in the general election, or vice versa. For example, during the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination campaign, challenger Bernie Sanders attracted support by promising to expand government health insurance programs. While this promise was popular among Democratic activists, contributors, and primary voters, and helped Sanders to compete in a close race against Joe Biden for the nomination, it would likely have to cost Sanders or any Democratic candidate considerable support in the general election. A candidate issues positions as described in his or her platform to help mobilize supporters and attract volunteers, activists, interest group endorsements, and contributions. Issue positions also define what a government will seek to do differently, depending on who gets elected. Even so, there is considerable evidence that many voters do not know much about candidates' issue positions, particularly in House and Senate races. As a result, when a candidate wins a race or a party wins a seat across the country, it is risky to read the outcome as a sign that the winners had the most popular set of issue positions. Campaign staff. Another thing candidates do before the campaign is build their campaign organization. The success or failure of these efforts is another signal of a candidate's prospects. If experienced, well-respected people work for a candidate's campaign, observers conclude that the candidate's prospects for being elected are probably good. Indeed, skilled campaign consultants are highly desirable. The planned strategies run public opinion polls, assemble ads, and buy television time, and talk with members of the media on the candidate's behalf, among other things. While only the most well-funded campaigns can afford top consultants, almost all campaigns have paid and volunteer staff, ranging from the dozen or so people who work for a typical House candidate to the thousands who run a majority party candidate's presidential campaign. Primaries and the general election. Officially, the general election campaigns begin in early September. By then, candidates have announced their intent to run and have built their campaign organizations. Primary campaigns and elections have taken place, and both parties have chosen their presidential nominees and their congressional candidates. Interest groups, candidates, and party committees have raised most of the funds they will use or donate in the campaign. The race is on. Name recognition. One fundamental campaign strategy, particularly in congressional campaigns, is to build name recognition. Since many citizens know fairly little about congressional candidates, efforts to increase a candidate's name recognition can deliver a few extra percentage points of support, enough to turn a close defeat into victory. If the only thing a citizen knows is the name of one of the candidates, that citizen will almost surely vote for that candidate on election day. The importance of name recognition is one reason why campaigns invest in buttons, bumper stickers, and yard signs, all of which help ensure that voters know a candidate's name. Getting out the vote. A second basic strategy is mobilization. Turnout is not automatic. Candidates have to make sure that their supporters actually go to the polls and vote, or make sure they have an absentee ballot.
Campaign professionals refer to voter mobilization efforts as GOTV, get the vote out, or the ground game. Most campaigns for Congress or the presidency use extensive door-to-door canvassing in which volunteers knock on doors and present their candidate's message to voters one at a time. Campaigns also commonly use phone banks, email campaigns, and social media to reach out to potential supporters. To determine how best to contact these people and convince them to vote, both Republican and Democratic campaigns use sophisticated databases, combining voter registration data with demographics. Sometimes these contacts are made through social media, but many campaigns still use volunteers to knock on doors and present their candidate's message to voters one at a time. Debates. Candidates often contrast their own records or positions with those of opposing candidates or make claims designed to lower voters' opinions of their opponents. Sometimes these interactions occur during a formal debate. Most congressional campaigns involve debates in front of an audience of likely voters, a group of reporters, or the editorial board of local newspaper. Typically, candidates take questions from reporters or a debate moderator, although sometimes candidates question each other or answer questions from the audience. Presidential campaigns involve multiple debates during the primary and caucus season. Throughout the months before the first primaries and caucuses, each party's candidates gather for many single-party debates using a variety of formats during the general election. The Republican and Democratic nominees meet for several debates. The number and format are negotiated between the campaigns and the Commission of the Presidential Debates, a nonpartisan organization that organizes the debates. The 2020 presidential campaign featured 2 debates between the presidential nominee and 1 between the vice presidential nominees. The debates offer valuable free exposure given a relatively uninterested electorate. Candidates must present themselves in a way that captures voters' attention and gains their support. Campaign advertising, getting the word out. One of the realities of modern American electoral campaigns is that they are, for the most part, conducted indirectly through social media, through news coverage of events, and most important, through paid campaign advertising. Candidates, party committees, and interest groups spend more than several $billion each election cycle for federal office. Most of that money is spent on 30-second television spots. Such advertising is critical because, as we discussed in Chapter 6, candidates cannot assume that citizens will take the time to learn from other sources about candidates, their qualifications, and other issue positions. Campaign advertising has evolved considerably over the last generation. During the early years of television, many campaign ads consisted of speeches by candidates or endorsements from supporters, and they ran several minutes in length. Today, in contrast, campaign ads are short, feature arresting images, and often use photo montages and bold text to engage a distracted citizenry. Content varies depending on who is running the ads, yet despite all the money and effort poured into campaign advertising, these ads must deliver a message that all viewers can understand without too much interpretation. One critical question about campaign advertising is whether the ads work, whether they shape what people know or influence their voting decisions or other forms of participation. Some observers have complained that campaign ads, particularly negative ads, depress voter turnout and reinforce citizens' negative perceptions of government, although political science research has uncovered no evidence for either effect. Insofar as ads matter and Americans pay attention to politics, studies of campaign advertising suggest that Americans are reasonably thought when assessing campaign ads. Evidence suggests that campaign advertising has several beneficial effects. Researchers have found that people who are exposed to campaign ads tend to be more interested in the campaign and know more about the candidates. Moreover, many candidate campaign ads highlight real differences between the candidates and the parties. Even so, average citizens know that they cannot believe everything they see on television. So campaign advertising, if it does anything at all, captures their attention without necessarily changing their minds. See What Do the Facts Say feature on page 265. I will load that in so that you can pause that. This is the end of chapter 8, part 1.